Most histories of the Second World War focus on power. Who fought hardest? Who produced the most? Who decided the final outcome? Yet some of the most decisive contributions came from states that did none of those things directly. Canada was one of them. Positioned between the United States, Britain held TA. This and why did Canada matter so much without commanding armies or empires? And how did it become the critical link that allowed the Atlantic Alliance to function? Before the outbreak of the Second World War, Canada occupied a position that was unusual not because of overwhelming power, but because of structural relevance. To understand how Canada later became a crucial link between the United States and Britain, it is necessary to begin with a more basic question. Why did Canada matter at all before the shooting started? The answer lies in a convergence of geography, political maturity, and institutional credibility that few other states possessed in the late 1930s. Geographically, Canada sat astride two strategic worlds. To the east, it faced the North Atlantic routes that tied Britain to its empire, and increasingly to North America. To the south, it shared the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, a country whose industrial potential far exceeded its immediate willingness to fight. Geography alone, however, does not create influence. Many states occupy useful locations without shaping events. What distinguished Canada was its ability to operate within both strategic environments simultaneously, without being perceived as an extension of either. Politically, Canada had reached a critical stage of constitutional development. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 formalized Canadian legislative independence, allowing Ottawa to determine its own foreign and defense policies. This mattered profoundly. Canada entered the late 1930s not as a colony awaiting instruction, but as a self-governing state capable of independent judgment, yet still deeply embedded in British legal traditions, administrative practices, and strategic thinking. This dual identity gave Canada credibility in London without triggering suspicion in Washington. Equally important was Canada's relationship with the United States. Long before the war, Canadian and American economies were already tightly integrated through trade, transportation networks, and shared industrial standards. At the same time, Canada was not perceived as a rival or a threat. Its military posture was modest, its ambitions limited, and its diplomacy cautious. This combination made Canada a uniquely acceptable partner for American planners who were wary of European entanglements, but increasingly aware that geographic isolation no longer guaranteed security. Institutionally, Canada had something else that mattered greatly in an era of total war: stability. Its political system was predictable, its civil service professional, and its social cohesion strong enough to sustain large-scale mobilization without internal fracture. For both Britain and the United States, Canada represented a dependable environment, one where long-term planning, resource coordination, and sensitive cooperation could occur without the disruptions faced by frontline states. There is a quiet irony here. Canada's emerging importance did not stem from dramatic assertions of power or nationalist fervor. It arose from restraint, reliability, and an absence of pretension. In an international system increasingly defined by extremes, Canada's moderation became an asset. It was trusted, not because it dominated, but because it connected. By 1939, then, Canada had not yet acted as a bridge, but the conditions were firmly in place. Geography provided access, sovereignty provided agency, and credibility provided opportunity. The next section examines how these latent advantages were activated once war began, transforming potential into industrial and logistical reality. When war began in 1939, Canada's importance was no longer a matter of latent positioning, but of practical function. The critical question now became not why Canada mattered, but how it transformed its geographic and political advantages into industrial and logistical power, linking the United States and Britain. The answer lies in Canada's ability to act as a secure, flexible, and credible intermediary at a moment when the Atlantic world was economically fragmented and strategically uncertain. In the early years of the war, Britain faced an acute dilemma. It required vast quantities of food, raw materials, and manufactured goods. Yet its financial reserves were limited, and its shipping lanes under constant threat. The United States, by contrast, possessed immense industrial capacity, but remained politically constrained by neutrality laws and domestic reluctance to enter another European war. Canada occupied the narrow but vital space between these two realities. As a belligerent nation with direct Atlantic access and close economic integration with the United States, Canada could facilitate flows of goods and resources that neither Britain nor the United States could manage alone at that stage. Canada's industrial mobilization was rapid, but deliberately pragmatic, rather than attempting to compete with American mass production or British specialization. Canadian industry focused on complementarity. Factories expanded to produce vehicles, aircraft components, munitions, and industrial materials that could be integrated smoothly into broader Allied supply chains. Equally important was Canada's role in food production and resource extraction, providing agricultural output, minerals, and energy at scale and with relative security from enemy attack. Logistically, Canada functioned as a safe processing and transit zone. Goods could be sourced or partially manufactured using American inputs, refined or assembled in Canada, and then shipped across the Atlantic under Canadian or British control. This arrangement reduced political friction for Washington, alleviated financial pressure on London, and improved overall efficiency. It was not a hidden system, nor a secret one, but it was an unusually effective workaround in a constrained strategic environment. Financial mechanisms reinforced this role. Canada extended credits, absorbed costs, and delayed repayment in ways that sustained British purchasing power while American policy gradually evolved. These measures were not acts of altruism alone. They reflected a sober understanding that Allied survival depended on continuity of supply. Canada's willingness to shoulder short-term burdens enhanced its credibility with both partners and strengthened its position as a trusted coordinator. What distinguished Canada's contribution was not the scale of any single factory or shipment, but the systemic reliability of the whole. Production schedules were predictable, transport networks resilient, and administrative coordination professional. In a war defined by disruption, Canada offered steadiness. Its ports functioned, its railways ran, and its institutions adapted without dramatic upheaval. By the early 1940s, Canada had moved beyond potential into performance. Geography had been converted into logistics, sovereignty into policy, trust into throughput. The next section turns from material coordination to political function, examining how Canada also became a diplomatic and strategic intermediary as British urgency and American caution had to be aligned. By the early 1940s, industrial output and logistics had begun to bind the Atlantic allies together. Yet material flows alone could not resolve a deeper challenge: political alignment. Britain was fighting for survival and pressed for urgency. The United States remained cautious, balancing strategic sympathy with domestic constraint. Canada's next contribution lay in answering a different question: how could two partners with unequal exposure and unequal timelines be brought into effective coordination without coercion? Canada's value as an intermediary rested first on credibility. Ottawa was a belligerent nation that shared Britain's sense of existential risk, but it also maintained intimate, practical ties with Washington. Canadian officials understood American political sensitivities not as abstractions, but as daily realities shaped by Congress, public opinion, and economic priorities. This dual literacy allowed Canada to translate British urgency into terms American policymakers could accept and American caution into constraints British planners could understand. Much of this work occurred through informal diplomacy rather than formal treaty-making. Canadian ministers, civil servants, and military planners maintained continuous contact with counterparts on both sides of the Atlantic. These exchanges helped smooth disagreements over production priorities, shipping allocations, and the pace of mobilization. Canada did not dictate outcomes. Instead, it framed problems in ways that reduced friction and clarified trade-offs. In effect, it acted as a political buffer, absorbing tensions that might otherwise have hardened into mistrust. A crucial aspect of this intermediary role was Canada's ability to speak candidly without appearing self-interested. Unlike Britain, Canada was not fighting under immediate threat of invasion. Unlike the United States, it did not possess overwhelming industrial leverage. This relative moderation gave Canadian interventions a tone of practicality rather than pressure. When Canadian officials argued for accelerated coordination or adjusted priorities, their recommendations carried weight precisely because they were perceived as balanced rather than partisan. Canada's intermediary function also extended to strategic planning. As discussions emerged over how, when, and where Allied forces should eventually engage on the European continent, Canadian participation helped normalize collaboration between British and American staffs. Canada provided a setting, both literal and institutional, where joint thinking could occur before formal American entry into the war. These interactions did not erase differences, but they prevented paralysis by keeping dialogue continuous and constructive. There is a restrained irony in Canada's influence during this phase. Its diplomatic effectiveness depended less on decisive authority than on patience. Canada could afford to wait, explain, and adjust because its own survival did not hinge on immediate decisions. In a crisis-driven environment, this capacity for measured engagement became a strategic asset. By the time the United States entered the war in late 1941, much of the groundwork for cooperation had already been laid. Channels were open, habits of consultation established, and expectations aligned. Canada had helped transform a relationship marked by hesitation into one capable of sustained collaboration. With political coordination increasingly normalized, the nature of Canada's role evolved again. The next section examines how Canada became not just a mediator, but a shared operational space, where American and British cooperation was tested, refined, and made routine. As political coordination matured and the United States formally entered the war, the relationship among the Allies shifted from negotiation to execution. The question was no longer whether cooperation would occur, but how it would be practiced at scale. Canada's role evolved accordingly. It became a shared operational space, neither a battlefield nor a distant headquarters, where American and British systems could be aligned through daily use rather than abstract agreement. This function proved critical in transforming alliance commitments into workable military reality. Canada offered something rare in wartime: a stable, secure environment close to the centers of Allied power, but insulated from direct enemy attack. This made it an ideal location for joint training, planning, and experimentation. Forces from the United States and Britain could operate on Canadian territory without the political sensitivities that might arise elsewhere. There were no sovereignty disputes, no competing strategic agendas, and no immediate combat pressures distorting priorities. What mattered was interoperability. Training programs exemplified this role. Canadian facilities hosted personnel who would later serve in combined operations, allowing differences in doctrine, command culture, and technical standards to be identified and resolved early. Procedures for communications, logistics, and command coordination were tested repeatedly in controlled conditions. Problems could be corrected without the cost of battlefield failure. Over time, cooperation became less a matter of negotiation and more a matter of habit. Canada also functioned as a testing ground for coordination at the institutional level. Joint committees, planning staffs, and administrative frameworks developed in Canada helped normalize collaboration between American and British organizations that had previously operated largely independently. This process was incremental and often unremarkable, but its cumulative effect was profound. By the mid-war years, cooperation no longer required constant justification. It was simply the default mode of operation. Equally important was Canada's role as a logistical and organizational buffer. Canadian infrastructure absorbed the strain of moving personnel, equipment, and information across the Atlantic system. Ports, railways, and administrative agencies provided continuity at moments when frontline demands fluctuated sharply. In doing so, Canada reduced friction between Allied partners by ensuring that operational coordination did not collapse under pressure. What distinguished Canada's contribution in this phase was not innovation for its own sake, but consistency. The country did not seek to impose new doctrines or assert leadership. Instead, it provided the space and institutional reliability necessary for others to align their approaches. In a war that demanded unprecedented levels of integration, this quiet facilitation mattered more than dramatic gestures. There is a subtle lesson here. Alliances are often judged by declarations and high-level agreements, yet their durability depends on mundane processes, training schedules, shared procedures, and predictable administration. Canada's operational role addressed precisely these requirements. By hosting cooperation rather than directing it, Canada helped make Allied integration routine rather than exceptional. As the war progressed, this operational intimacy reshaped Canada's standing within the alliance. It was no longer merely a connector or intermediary, but a participant in the architecture of cooperation itself. The next section examines why this wartime role did not fade with victory, and how it positioned Canada as a permanent transatlantic link in the post-war order. The end of the Second World War did not dissolve the structures of cooperation that had developed across the Atlantic. Instead, it raised a new and more enduring question. Why did Canada retain its role as a key link between the United States and Britain even after the wartime emergency had passed? The answer lies in institutional momentum, strategic trust, and the long-term consequences of wartime integration. During the war, Canada had not simply contributed resources or hosted activities, it had become embedded in the process of alliance management. Administrative systems, defense planning habits, and economic coordination mechanisms developed under wartime pressure did not disappear in 1945. They persisted because they worked. Canadian officials, military planners, and diplomats had accumulated experience in navigating transatlantic cooperation that few other states possessed. This expertise made Canada useful in peacetime precisely because it was tested under far harsher conditions. Crucially, Canada emerged from the war without the liabilities that burdened other powers. Britain, though victorious, faced economic exhaustion and imperial retrenchment. The United States emerged dominant, but also increasingly cautious about overextension. Canada, by contrast, retained economic stability, political cohesion, and institutional confidence. It was neither weakened nor overstretched. This positioning allowed Canada to continue acting as a stabilizing presence, an intermediary that understood British constraints and American priorities without being fully absorbed by either. Path dependence played a central role. Wartime decisions had locked in patterns of cooperation that were costly to abandon and unnecessary to replace. Trade flows, defense coordination, and intelligence sharing practices all reflected habits formed between 1939 and 1945. Canada's role as a bridge was no longer improvisational, it was structural. Altering it would have required deliberate disengagement, which none of the parties found advantageous. Equally important was Canada's reputation. Throughout the war, Canada had demonstrated reliability without seeking dominance. It honored commitments, managed resources responsibly, and avoided politicizing cooperation for short-term gain. In the post-war environment, this reputation translated into trust. Canada was perceived as predictable, a quality often undervalued in theory, but essential in practice. For both Washington and London, Canada represented continuity in an era of rapid geopolitical change. There is a further irony worth noting. Canada's enduring influence did not come from attempting to redefine itself as a great power. Instead, it accepted the limits of its size and leveraged them. By focusing on coordination rather than command, and on facilitation rather than assertion, Canada ensured that its voice remained relevant even as the balance of power shifted decisively toward the United States. By the late 1940s, Canada's wartime role had quietly solidified into a peacetime function. It was no longer merely a bridge forged by necessity, but a link maintained by choice. The final section turns to why this experience still matters today, and what Canada's wartime role reveals about the enduring value of middle powers in complex alliances. Looking back from the present, Canada's role during the Second World War raises a final and broader question. Why does this experience still matter for understanding alliances today? The answer lies not in nostalgia or national pride, but in the enduring lessons Canada offers about how complex coalitions actually function. Canada's wartime position between the United States and Britain reveals how influence can be exercised without dominance, and how stability can be as strategically valuable as power. Modern alliances often assume that effectiveness flows from hierarchy, clear leaders, clear followers, and decisive authority. Canada's wartime experience suggests a more nuanced reality. The Allied system worked not only because the strongest actors led, but because intermediate actors connected. Canada reduced friction, absorbed uncertainty, and translated between different political cultures. These functions rarely attract attention, yet without them, coordination becomes brittle and prone to break down under stress. One enduring lesson is the strategic value of connective capacity. Canada did not attempt to control outcomes. It focused on keeping processes moving. In practice, this meant maintaining trust, ensuring continuity, and providing institutional spaces where cooperation could be normalized. These roles are especially important when partners differ in scale, urgency, or political constraints. As Britain and the United States did during the war, and as many allies still do today. Another lesson concerns restraint. Canada's effectiveness depended on knowing what not to do. It avoided overstatement, resisted the temptation to moralize disagreements, and accepted that progress often occurred incrementally. This approach may appear unambitious, but it proved resilient. In contemporary international politics, where polarization and symbolic posturing are common, Canada's wartime conduct highlights the quiet power of moderation. There is also a cautionary implication. Canada's influence was not automatic. It was earned through performance. Reliability, administrative competence, and consistency over time created credibility that could not be manufactured quickly. Middle powers seeking relevance today cannot assume that alignment alone confers influence. Canada mattered because others trusted it to act predictably under pressure. Finally, Canada's wartime role challenges simplistic measures of contribution. Victory in total war depended not only on battlefield outcomes, but on logistics, coordination, and institutional endurance. Canada's contribution was embedded in these less visible domains. Its success reminds us that history often turns on systems rather than moments, and on facilitators rather than heroes. In this sense, Canada's experience during World War II remains analytically valuable. It demonstrates how a state of limited size can shape outcomes by focusing on integration rather than assertion, and on reliability rather than spectacle. These lessons remain relevant in an era defined by complex alliances, distributed power, and persistent uncertainty. If you found this analysis valuable, consider following the channel, leaving a comment, or continuing with our next exploration of how wartime alliances reshape the post-war world.